So what I'd like to deal with here principally is Aquinas' first way, his argument from motion. Though what I'm going to talk about will also apply to the argument from efficient causes and the argument from contingencies. But we'll deal primarily with the argument from motion, because, as Aquinas says, it is the most clear of the three. Now, it begins by pointing out that change occurs in the universe. That is not really a controversial claim. I think most people will be willing to grant it, though it can become controversial. So we'll just grant it for the sake of argument here. And what change involves, or the way that we're going to conceptualize of change, is as the actualization of some potential. I have coffee in my cup, for example, and this coffee is actually hot. It has the potential to become cool. And for it to become cool, that potency of coolness must be actualized. And Aquinas is also going to state that it must be the case that the thing which actualizes that potency is itself actual. And what this entails then is that nothing can actualize itself if there is some potency, which if there's actualization to occur, there must be potency. So that means then that what we are talking about here is essentially ordered causal series, which is opposed to a one-to-one series, but we will touch on that later. There are certain interesting properties of essentially ordered causal series, which are derived from the fact that there are certain properties of the relations of causes and effects, and these properties are asymmetry and irreflexiveness. And with these two properties, there's the implication of the fact that the causal power of all the intermediary causes in such a series are wholly derivative. Now, what does asymmetry mean when we're talking about properties of relations? Asymmetry has to do with the fact that if x has some relation r to y, then y does not have relation r to x. A good example of this is a child of. If Bill is a child of Bob, then Bob is not a child of Bill. Another property is irreflexiveness. Irreflexive has to do with if for all x, it does not have relation r to x. And what that means is, for example, to the left of. X can be to the left of y, but it cannot be to the left of itself. And in a similar manner, it's asymmetric because an effect of a cause, something can have the relation of being an effect to a cause, which then implies that that thing which it is the effect of cannot be an effect of the effect. And that has a sort of parallelness to what is said in the argument from efficient causes, which is that nothing can be the efficient cause of itself, because that would imply that it existed before it existed, which is a logical contradiction. Now, irreflexiveness is very similar, and it has to do with the fact that nothing which is contingent, can be a cause of itself. If something is, an effect, it cannot be the effect of itself. If something is a cause, it cannot be the cause of itself when we're talking about causes and effects. Now, what this entails then is that an intermediary cause is a cause in virtue of it being the effect of all prior intermediary causes. So if that's the case, then we would also think, well, since it's derivative and this entire series of intermediary causes is derivative only in its causal power, and we know that it's causing things because we agreed that change does occur, then that means that there must be something from which this causal power is derived. Something which is not just another intermediary cause, but is an independent and has the sufficient conditions for its own causal power. And that would be something which is purely actual, for the very reason that a purely actual being is able to actualize another, because what is required to actualize another, to be an actualizer, is that that thing is itself actual. And if something is purely actual, well, then it is wholly independent, because it cannot even be actualized by another thing, nor does it ever need to be actualized by another thing to actualize others. So, such a being, a purely actual being, would be the sufficient cause of its own independent ability to move things or to cause things. It would have independent causal power, which is required in an essentially ordered causal series. Now, the interesting thing about the argument from motion is that it's often framed in this sort of way where we're talking about, infinite regress versus, the universe having a finite number of causes and effects. Well, Aquinas would even admit, along with Aristotle, which he does in his commentary on the metaphysics, that even if there were an infinite number of these intermediary causes, that would not make such an independent, unmoved mover unnecessary, for the very reason that even if you have an infinite number of these intermediaries, the entirety of the set, right, still is wholly derivative, okay, or the entirety of the series is wholly derivative, okay, and there would be nothing for this series to, or no way for this series to begin its causal relations, okay, for the very reason that it is only causal in virtue of the fact that it is an effect, okay? And we've already explained earlier why it cannot be the case that it just goes on without there being something which is independently and sufficiently its own causal principle. Obviously, because nothing can exist prior to itself, and nothing can be the cause of itself. If it is a cause, it can't be its own cause. If it is an effect, it cannot be its own effect. It doesn't follow. We know that. Those are logical contradictions. So, with this understood, we should conceptualize and think of essentially ordered causal series as a sort of vertical or hierarchical relation, as opposed to a horizontal or temporal relation, which would be what we would associate with a one-to-one causal series, because it's not, right? And a very good way to illustrate this is in the fact that if you take away the first term, then you lose all, for the very reason that W has causal power only in virtue of the fact that it's an effect of V, and X only has causal power in virtue of the fact that it's an effect of W, which has causal power in virtue of the fact that it is an effect of V. And with that understood, we can see why Aquinas uses this reductio ad absurdum against an infinite regress, or an infinite number of only intermediary causes without a first independent mover, for all three of his arguments, which are going to involve essentially ordered causal series, which is the argument from motion, the argument from contingencies, and the argument from efficient causes. With that understood, I hope that you have learned something, and I hope that I've helped you in your theological or philosophical journey. Thank you, and God bless.